Today we are looking at a case from the second part of the 19th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Emeline Lucy Bates was born in June 1838 in Barry in Vermont. She grew up as the seventh of 12 children in a bustling household, typical of the era. In 1857, at the age of 18, she married Horace Meaker, a young farmhand who travelled from town to town seeking seasonal labour. After their marriage, Emeline joined Horace in his itinerant lifestyle, often working alongside him in the fields. In 1858, the couple settled briefly in Plainfield, Vermont, where they welcomed their first child, a daughter named Nellie. With their growing family, the Meakers managed to purchase a modest home in the town. In 1859, they celebrated the birth of their second child, a son who they named Cecil. However, their stay in Plainfield was short-lived, and by 1860, they sold their property and returned to Barry, where Horace worked alongside Emeline's father, who owned a small farm. Emeline, now a mother of two, focused on caring for her young children and managing the household. In 1861, Emeline gave birth to their third child, a boy who they named Almon Lewis, but their joy was overshadowed by heartbreak. In October, young Cecil contracted diphtheria, a devastating illness known as the children's plague. The disease, so often fatal for children under 5, claimed Cecil's life before his second birthday, leaving the family grief-stricken. The following year, in 1862, the Civil War brought further upheaval when Horace enlisted into the 6th Vermont Infantry. With her husband away at war, Emeline shouldered the immense responsibilities of taking charge of her father's farm, in addition to caring for her young children. Her days were filled with back-breaking labour, ploughing fields, planting potatoes, shoveling manure, and hauling heavy buckets of sap for her father's sugar farming operation. This relentless work, which she carried out for over 2 years, exemplified her resilience and determination to provide for her family in her husband's absence. Horace returned home in May 1864, physically and emotionally scarred by the war. Although he was fortunate to have survived, a fate that eluded over 5,000 men from Vermont who fought in the Civil War, his health was permanently compromised. The war had left him frail and battling a range of chronic ailments, and by the 1870s, he had lost most of his hearing. Emeline too suffered a similar fate, as her hearing deteriorated over the years that followed. Medical theories suggest their shared hearing loss may have been caused by syphilis, a disease that Horace likely contracted during his military service and unknowingly passed on to his wife. Despite these hardships, the Meakers endeavoured to build a life for themselves. Using Horace's military pension, they secured a mortgage on a farm near Duxbury Corner, where they hoped to find some stability. By this time, their eldest daughter Nellie had grown up and moved out to start her own life. However, Almon, their teenage son, remained at home. He was cruelly described by neighbours as simple-minded, although he played a vital role in assisting his mother with the farm work, especially as his father's health continued to decline. In 1879, Horace received a letter that concerned his much younger half-siblings, named Alice and Henry, who had been placed in an orphanage after their mother, a woman named Mary Hates, could no longer care for them. Mary, Horace's stepmother, was far younger than his father, a man named Orrin Meaker, who had remarried after the death of Horace's mother. Mary and Orrin had 2 children together, a daughter, born in August 1870, named Mary Jane, but commonly called Alice, and a son named Henry, born in July 1872. The orphanage where Alice and Henry lived was overcrowded, underfunded, and ill-equipped to care for its residents. It included orphans and people with disabilities. Life there was harsh, especially for Alice, who struggled to adapt. Her defiance and spirited nature made her a target for the overseer, who found her behaviour difficult to manage. Henry, being younger and more subdued, adjusted more easily. However, the strain of caring for so many children with limited resources made Alice's presence particularly unwelcome. Desperate to relieve the burden, the overseer wrote to Horace to see if he would take the children in. He proposed that the town provide the Meakers with an agreed amount of money so they could raise Alice and Henry until they reached adulthood. Although the sum was far from substantial, the children represented 2 extra pairs of hands that could help him with the unrelenting demands of farm life. Without consulting his wife, he accepted the offer, and on the 5th of May 1879, Alice and Henry were brought to the town, where Horace picked them up and took them to their new home. However, his decision quickly revealed an underlying tension. Emeline, already burdened by years of hard labour and the demands of her household, was not supportive of the arrangement, especially as she had not been consulted. At 40 years of age, she appeared far older than her years. Her weathered face and gruff demeanour reflected a life spent toiling under the harsh sun, ploughing fields, and managing the relentless work of rural survival. To her, Alice and Henry were not family, but additional responsibilities, and she soon began to harbour a particular disdain for Alice. Henry was quiet and obedient, and managed to avoid much of Emeline's anger by blending into the background and doing as he was told. Alice, however, struggled to adapt. Her spirited nature clashed with Emeline's harsh authority, and she quickly became the target of her frustrations. Punishments were always swift and severe, and for the smallest infractions, Emeline would grab her broom and, using the handle, strike Alice. As time went on, the cruelty escalated. When beating seemed insufficient, Emeline began withholding food from the young girl, leaving her hungry and increasingly vulnerable. The Meakers' neighbours were Charles Amlington and his teenage daughter Jeanie, who rented a house on their property. One summer evening in 1879, Jeanie was home alone when she heard a piercing scream that sounded distinctly like a young girl. Shortly afterwards, she heard repetitive thuds, which she interpreted as the sounds of Alice enduring another severe beating. Charles, too, witnessed Emeline's abusive behaviour firsthand. On one occasion, he saw her beating Alice and threatening to whip her to death. Sadly, these incidents were not isolated, and the Amingtons and other locals observed numerous acts of cruelty, yet no one ever intervened. Whether due to fear, indifference, or social norms of the time, the community's lack of action to do anything allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. On the morning of Saturday the 24th of April 1880, just 11 months after his half-siblings Alice and Henry had come to live with him, Horace Meaker noticed that Alice was missing from the home. Worried, he asked his wife if she knew where the young girl had gone. Emeline, appearing quite unbothered, casually said that Alice must have taken some of her clothes and run away during the night. Horace found the explanation unsettling, but refrained from pressing the issue any further. He needed to find the girl, however, as unbeknown to his wife, he had arranged for another family to take her in, as he had decided that removing her from the increasingly hostile environment in their home would give the young girl a chance of a more peaceful life. After a few hours with no sign of Alice, he suggested to his wife that they should go and look for her. However, Emeline told him that it would be best just to wait. Her strange, unconcerned attitude, coupled with her dismissive tone, struck him as odd. Her reasoning was that Alice had run away of her own accord, and searching for her would be pointless. As the day progressed and word of Alice's disappearance spread, neighbours began asking questions about what had happened. When pressed for details, Emeline gave vague and inconsistent answers, claiming at one point that Alice had run away, and at another that she had no idea where the girl might be. When Almond was questioned, his account of the previous evening didn't align with his mother's. The more the two spoke, the more their stories conflicted, with small discrepancies growing into glaring contradictions. These inconsistencies, combined with Emeline's usually cold demeanour and insistence that there be no search for Alice, only deepened the neighbours' suspicions that something was terribly wrong. Locals who had been long uneasy about Emeline's treatment of Alice, and who had frequently witnessed her harsh punishments and dismissive attitude towards the young girl, were particularly concerned for the child. After hearing the conflicting accounts from Emeline and Almond about the poor girl's sudden disappearance, they came to the conclusion that Alice had not simply run away, especially given her frail state and lack of resources. As the story of the little girl's disappearance spread, the community's unease deepened. People knew that Emeline was a cruel and uncaring woman, and wondered if something more sinister had taken place. With suspicions mounting, a group of concerned locals decided to take action. Mr. Jacob Foss and Mr. Eber Huntley were nominated to speak to the local deputy sheriff, a man named Frank Atherton, and report not only Alice's disappearance, but also Emeline's history of mistreatment and the troubling inconsistencies in her and Almond's accounts. The deputy sheriff, though initially sceptical, listened carefully to their testimonies and then decided that due to the community's growing anxiety, he would look into the matter further. On the 26th of April, police officers visited the Meakers' home to question Emeline and Almon. Initially, both insisted that Alice had run away and claimed to have no knowledge of her whereabouts. However, officers soon noticed the domineering influence Mrs. Meaker held over her son and decided to question Almon privately. They took the boy to the offices of a man named Mr. E.F. Palmer, where they could speak to him away from his mother's intimidating presence. Almon quickly broke down under the weight of the interrogation and confessed to the horrifying crime. He revealed that his mother had grown increasingly resentful of Alice, viewing her as an unbearable burden. One evening she had confided in him, declaring that Alice would be better off dead. Almon said that his mother described the girl as a constant cause of trouble and claimed that she could no longer tolerate her presence in their home. Almon told the officers that although disturbed by his mother's words, he did not challenge her. Instead, he listened in silence and ultimately agreed to assist her in carrying out the unthinkable. He said at first she devised a plan to take Alice into the wilderness and abandon her so she could wander off and disappear. But he told officers that he quickly dismissed this idea, knowing that it would be far too risky and unlikely to succeed. He said that instead, his mother came up with another plan, one that seemed quite simple, that they would poison her. He told the officers that his mother then sent him to a pharmacy to purchase strychnine, and while in town, he rented a carriage for the following day. He went on to say that on the night of the 23rd of April, the plan was set in motion. He and his mother waited until Alice was asleep before grabbing her from her bed, putting a sack over her head, and then they took her out to the carriage. He said that they stopped by the stream, where they pulled the young girl to the floor, and that his mother took the poison from him, poured it into a drink, and then handed it to Alice, forcing her to drink it. He said that by now Alice was resisting, but his mother was much stronger than she was, and she held her tightly. He went on to say that within moments, Alice began to violently convulse, and his mother held her mouth shut to keep her quiet. He then said that they put Alice back in the carriage and drove for about another 3 miles. He hesitated, now speaking in a shaky voice. He said that the convulsions lasted for what seemed like an eternity, maybe as long as 20 minutes, as he saw Alice fighting for her life, her body writhing in agony. But finally, her movement slowed, and her body went limp, and he realized that she was dead. He said that they stopped in a swampy area by a stream and quickly buried her. Though Almon had been complicit in the act, it was obvious to the officers that he was haunted by the memory of that night. He couldn't understand why he had allowed it to happen, why he had helped his mother carry out such a terrible plan. But it was done, and Alice was dead. Almon then led the deputy sheriff and other officers to the place where Alice had been buried. The grave was shallow, and her body was soon exhumed. As the men carefully uncovered her, the bruises from the violent struggle were still visible on her skin, a grim reminder of the cruelty she had endured in her final moments. However, when they attempted to transport Alice's body back, they encountered an unexpected problem. The buggy was too small to accommodate the body properly, so Almon was forced to hold it upright throughout the journey. As they made their way across the fields, Almon struggled to keep the lifeless form from slipping out of the buggy. The weight of his actions pressed down on him with every mile. Strangely, the next day, Almon Meaker retracted his confession and insisted that it was he that had killed Alice and that he had acted alone. Nevertheless, he and his mother were both charged with murder. At their hearing on the 10th of May in Waterbury, Emeline and Almon faced an enraged mob. News of Alice's death had spread widely, leaving the community seething with anger. During the hearing, Dr. August Withouse, a professor of chemistry at the University of Vermont, presented his findings from Alice's autopsy and confirmed that strychnine was found in her stomach. Over the course of the 2-day hearing, more than a dozen witnesses testified about the abuse Alice had endured at Emeline's hands. When the hearing concluded, it was decided that both Emeline and Almon Meaker would be committed to stand trial, which was scheduled to begin on the 22nd of November 1880. There was much debate over whether they should be tried separately or together, but ultimately it was decided that they should face trial jointly. When the trial started, Mrs. Meaker appeared very different than she had at the time of her arrest. She was no longer as haggard, and her figure had filled out. She sat neatly dressed, wearing gloves, her demeanour far more composed, as she surveyed the courtroom. Beside her sat her son, Almon, dressed in a new suit, his hair neatly brushed, and although his face seemed to bear the marks of weakness, he smiled, as if he was almost pleased by the proceedings. The pair sat hand in hand, just as they had done at the first hearing in Waterbury, but something was about to change. After speaking with his defence attorneys, Almon changed his plea to guilty, a move that left his mother to face the jury alone. Emeline's legal team, in a last-ditch effort to save her, attempted to shift the blame entirely onto her son. They claimed that Almon had carried out the murder of Alice without his mother's knowledge, portraying the young man as a sole instigator of the crime. They argued that Emeline had been unaware of Almon's intentions and had had no involvement in the brutal act. They tried to paint a picture of a mother who was innocent, claiming that she had been unaware of the violent turn Almon had taken and had no part in the tragedy that unfolded. However, witnesses were presented that told of the cruelty that Emeline had always displayed towards the child. Mr. Charles Arlington testified to seeing instances of abuse by Mrs. Meaker towards Alice. He said that on one occasion he heard her shout, "I'll whip you to death if you don't mind," while the child pleaded desperately, begging her not to whip her anymore and promising to do anything if she would stop. Mr. Arlington told the court that once when he visited the Meaker household, he saw the little girl knitting, and then Mrs. Meaker snatched the knitting from her hands and scolded her harshly, shouting, "Don't you know better how to knit than that?" She then slapped the child on the side of her head and repeated the chilling threats, "I'll whip you to death and won't leave you alive." On a third occasion, Mr. Arlington said that he was returning home late at night when he saw Mrs. Meaker in the shed whipping the girl over the head and shoulders with a narrow strip of wood. He told of how the child cried out for mercy, begging and promising to obey if only the abuse would stop. Another witness, named Mr. Henry, provided a disturbing account of the repeated abuse he observed. He stated that he had seen Mrs. Meaker whip the child with a stick, grab her by the hair with one hand, while striking her with the other, and chase her into the field. On one occasion, as the child attempted to run from the house, he said that Mrs. Meaker seized her by the neck and shoved her violently back inside. He added that last fall, during the grain harvest, the young girl and boy fled the house together. The girl tripped and fell, at which point Mrs. Meaker grabbed her by the ear, lifted her off the ground, dragged her several feet, and shouted, "I'll learn you to run away every time a team drives up." He went on to say that in another incident, the child ran up the hill behind the house, pursued by Mrs. Meaker, who was unable to catch her. Frustrated, Mrs. Meaker screamed to her husband, "Why did you ever bring that thing here to torment me?" Mrs. E. Huntley, another witness, corroborated the grim details of the child's life. She described the girl as a young outcast, living a cheerless existence. Mrs. Huntley said that she had often invited Alice to play with her own daughter. However, the only response she ever received was a weak and sorrowful smile. The courtroom fell silent as these harrowing testimonies unfolded, painting a bleak and disturbing picture of the child's life under Mrs. Meaker's care. Each account deepened the sense of outrage among those who heard the shocking details. These testimonies severely undermined the defence's arguments, as so many witnesses had observed Mrs. Meaker's abusive behaviour towards Alice in the months leading up to the murder. The stark contrast between the defence's portrayal of Emeline as an innocent bystander and the witnesses who gave detailed accounts of her cruelty towards Alice left little room for doubts. It seemed clear that Emeline Meaker had played a significant role in the events leading up to the murder, undermining the defence's attempt to absolve her of responsibility. Emeline Lucy Meaker, undeterred by her attorney's advice, chose to take the stand in her defence. Her testimony was long and drawn out, as she recounted her difficult childhood and the hardships that she had faced throughout her life. She spoke at length about the loss of her son Cecil, her husband's departure to war, and the years of grueling manual labour that had worn her down. She recounted each detail with a sense of bitter nostalgia, but when it came to the events of the 23rd of April, her memory seemed curiously clouded. Her testimony, however, failed to convince the jury. They saw through her evasions and contradictions, and in the end, Emeline Lucy Meaker was found guilty of Alice's murder. When the jury delivered the verdict, they did so with little sympathy. After it was decided that the county court had made no errors in the case, both Emeline Meaker and her son Almon were sentenced to death. They were then transferred to the state prison. The verdict and sentences were appealed, and the case was reviewed by the Supreme Court, but the county court's decision was upheld. While in custody, Almond provided a detailed confession. His account revealed the growing resentment his mother harboured and her manipulative influence over him. This confession became the foundation of another appeal, as his legal team argued that he had acted under his mother's domination and was not the primary instigator of the crime. The appeal sparked intense debates, and eventually his sentence was commuted to life in prison. The decision brought a measure of closure to a case that had captivated the public and had raised profound questions about culpability and the influence of power dynamics within families. At 1:30 p.m. on the 30th of March 1883, Emeline Lucy Meaker was led to the gallows. 125 people were there to witness the spectacle. When asked if she had any final words, she replied, "May God forgive you all for hanging me, an innocent woman," and then pointing to the deputy sheriff, she said, "I am as innocent as the man standing here." None of Emeline's family were present for the hanging, nor was her body claimed for burial. Emeline Meaker was the first woman legally executed in Vermont. She was buried in the Escalation Cemetery in Windsor County. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.